You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 2nd of April 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Wisconsinians literally wouldn't vote for Elon Musk's preferred candidate if they were paid to. European law and order populists prepared to make an exception for one convicted criminal. And the Chinese piano glut. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina dos Santos and Michael Binyon will discuss the day's big stories, and we'll hear from Matt Ridley about what his new book about the mating rituals of the black grouse also teaches us about things other than the mating rituals of the black grouse. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Nina dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent, former CNN Europe editor, and Michael Binyon, foreign affairs specialist for The Times. Hello to you both.
Hello.
And we were talking earlier, and I know and I believe that this will serve as repudiation to anybody who may believe that the Monocle Daily is a forum of out-of-touch, ivory tower-dwelling metropolitan media elitists, that you were both recently at the same book launch.
That's right.
We were indeed, yes. The elite, metropolitan, all about... And it was a book launch about a journalist. So journalists
even better.
Writing about other journalists.
Our favourite
Two
subject.
journalists writing about another
Yeah,
journalist.
indeed, yes. It was a thriller, as it were. It was about a Sunday Times colleague from years ago who was assassinated in Egypt when he arrived there in the 70s, and nobody ever found out who did it or why. But the book looks at all the allegations swirling around that he was a spy. Was he a spy for the Americans? Was he a spy for the Russians, for the KGB? They more or less suggest that he was done in because he was a KGB spy and the CIA wanted him out of the way, and that the Egyptians did the dirty deed for them. But it's all a bit unclear, and they bring in all of us who ever talk to the two authors, including me.
Hang on, are you saying they managed to get journalists to talk about journalism?
On the record, dearie me, my gosh.
Because it's usually the last thing we want to talk about is our own industry.
Indeed.
No, we usually talk about other people, which is what we're about to do over the next half hour. But just to say about this particular book that Michael was talking about, what's interesting is that it's also an intergenerational look at the work of your paper, The Times and the Sunday Times, over all those years, because it's been written by two correspondents, one who used to work for your fine paper and another one who's my friend, who's younger, who now works for the paper, and they together picked up this story to try and crack this cold case. It's really interesting. It's called Murder in Cairo, in case anybody wants to
Well, I was going to ask, and it is always a tricky question to ask people who've just come in from a book launch, can anyone remember the title? but that is Murder in Cairo.
Yes.
That's it.
Can anyone recall the names of the authors off the top of their head?
Well, Manu is Emanuele
Midolo is the younger Italian journalist who does work for The Times today, and then Peter Bellamy is your former colleague.
That's right. And in fact, the Sunday Times set up a prize in memory of David Holden, the guy who was assassinated, and I won it years ago.
Congratulations.
Several degrees of separation.
I think we have completed some sort of circle of life there.
Yes.
Just before we move on, Nina, you have an event that you wish to make either. Well, actually, given that it's sold out, this isn't a tawdry plug, this is a tawdry boast.
Oh, right. Yeah, thanks. Well, no, I think it's just topical, really. I'm doing a couple of live events for my podcast called Control Alt Deceit, which is all about democracy being in danger and people controlling the narrative, foisting alternative agendas upon us. And I'm sure we're going to talk about some of those individuals who are accused of doing that in a moment's time. But I'm hosting a live taping of my podcast tomorrow evening at the Frontline Club, which is a venerable institution for, wait for it, more journalists.
Indeed.
And the topic that we're going to be discussing is whether or not Western-style liberal democracy is on life support, whether it's dead, or whether or not it needs to be reimagined. And I suppose we'll talk about this throughout the course of the show, because somebody like Marine Le Pen has been blocked from running from office in France.
She has, and we will come to that presently, but we will start in the United States, specifically in Wisconsin, the voters of which have resisted the blandishments of Elon Musk and elected the Democrat-supported Judge Susan Crawford to the state Supreme Court, preserving its liberal majority. Musk spent north of $20 million supporting her Conservative rival Brad Schimmel, disputably claiming that defeating Crawford was, quote, critical to civilization. Despite, or it would be amusing to believe, because of this, Crawford sauntered home by a comfortable double-digit margin. Musk's subsequent claim that, quote, I expected to lose, but there is value to losing a piece for a positional gain, a styling out of defeat to compare with Emperor Hirohito's post-Nagasaki assessment that the war has developed not necessarily to our advantage. Michael, it would be tempting to think so for all sorts of reasons, those reasons all of which can be boiled down to the fact that he is conceivably Earth's most annoying individual. But was this a vote against Elon Musk?
Partly, yes, but I also think it was partly a vote against Donald Trump and the chaos we've had since the start of his administration. Wisconsin has normally been a Democrat-leaning state. This time round, or last time, it voted with or for Trump. But
it did, yes. But that could easily be overturned. And I think, in line with much of the rest of the United States, opinion polls are beginning to go down for Trump. People are beginning to think they don't like inflation. They're worried about what all this turmoil over tariffs is going to cause. Most of all, they're worried about the price of eggs. That's what's really upset them, more than Ukraine or Gaza or any of that. But the fact is that there's a general mood that's beginning to turn sour on Trump, and I don't think Musk has improved it. In fact, I think he's probably annoyed more people all across the United States than any other single individual in the White House. Well, funnily enough, Nina, there is reporting today in Politico suggesting that Elon Musk may have delighted Donald Trump long enough. I'm actually kind of surprised it's taken this long.
I think all of us are, yeah, and it's been quite chaotic because obviously his Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, has been making all these grandiose claims about how it's cut all sorts of money off the federal budget, only for people, fact-checkers, and fact-checkers even from that side of the political spectrum have just sort of said, hang on a second, let's just do the maths again, run the numbers, and it turns out those numbers aren't actually true. There have been all sorts of embarrassing shenanigans with them firing crucial staff, on federal projects that, are pertinent to the nuclear initiatives and so on and so forth. And so perhaps Elon Musk, and this news has now been reported by the Daily Mail, the Times and other British newspapers too, so not just Politico, it seems as though he may well be stepping down. Perhaps he is being pushed out of the way because of those ineptitudes of his band of merry techno-pirates, or perhaps it's because of the result that we've seen in Wisconsin, where some people thought, well, look, him spending so much money on this campaign for one seat on the Supreme Court in this swing state, means that he's trying to buy us, and we don't want that.
Well, I mean, yeah, it would be nice to think that was the case, because there is a point here somewhere, Michael, about, I know this is a far from original observation, that the amounts of money in American politics are absolutely absurd, and I grant that it is a bigger country than the United Kingdom, but fun fact, 50% more was spent on this one race to elect a single judge in Wisconsin, and no disrespect to Wisconsin, but it is not a big state, than was spent on the entire general election in the United Kingdom last year.
Goodness, that's a figure. That really is. I mean, one wonders, is it worth that amount of money? And where is all this money coming from? Elon Musk, spending prodigiously, presumably his own money, profits from Tesla. Well, there he's got a problem because other people are beginning to think we don't like Tesla.
It is worth bearing in mind that for Elon Musk, spending $20 million is basically like me buying you a sandwich.
Yes, it's a small beer for him, but it's a large amount of money. And I think it really is a bit of a signal to the White House that things are not going quite as smoothly as they'd hoped, and that some of these bizarre announcements, which change every day, are beginning to annoy the general voter. It's possibly something to do with Wisconsin and something to do with the judge herself who won, who seems to be a very credible character, and she may have run a good campaign. I don't know the ins and outs, but I think it's being shown as a bit of a moral defeat for Trump, and he doesn't take moral or any other defeats lightly, and he'll look for a scapegoat. And Elon Musk, I think, has been lined up for some time as a scapegoat for the next time anything goes wrong, anything big goes wrong, and he'll be fired with the words, you screwed it up, or words to that effect.
And we will doubtless hear in due course that Elon Musk is a total loser who Donald Trump never even met, etc. etc. But just before we move off this, Nina, do we sense generally an amount of perhaps overdue sinew stiffening among Democrats, perhaps exemplified by Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey addressing the Senate for 25 solid hours, ending sometime last night, early this morning UK time, I think?
Yeah, I think that this success for the Democrats, because obviously Susan Crawford, who, as Michael was just saying before, is a well-known judge. She's 60 years old. She's well-known in the state of Wisconsin, but she was backed by the Democrats and won comfortably. And this perhaps will re-energise the kind of work that they need to do to try and regain trust from their electorate. And, you know, all eyes will be looking towards who would be their next sort of rallying candidate, not just for the presidency, you know, the next time it comes around. If Donald Trump, by the way, doesn't try something to change the rules to run for a third term, which he technically can't, but the midterms are really what they're looking for here.
Well, continuing with the theme of hyper-conservative demagogues having bad weeks, the conviction of Marine Le Pen, leader of France's National Rally Party, on charges of fiddling EU funds has prompted a bemusing but unsurprising outpouring of sympathy from her fellow populists, people not usually notable for a forgiving attitude towards criminals. Reminder that further derisive sneering at this hypocrisy is available in this week's Foreign Desk Explainer, which should be online now or now abouts. Le Pen has been fined and served a suspended jail sentence and banned from seeking public office for 5 years, scuppering her ambitions of winning France's presidency in 2027. European tub thumpers of the ilk of Orban, Meloni, Salvini, Farage and Wilders, as well inevitably as Elon Musk, have hastened to denounce this monstrous injustice. Nina, these people are usually very keen on law and order. Why are they prepared to make an exception for Marine Le Pen?
Well, so I think the concern here is that it's not so much the fact that there's been a verdict that has proven her to be, at least judged her to be guilty at this instance. It's the fact that it's going to take so long for her to have the right to appeal that eventually it'll sort of knock her out of the presidential race in 2027. That's the concern here, because the problem is that it's a message that we're starting to see, forces, especially from the right wing, that are keen to paint EU countries and the EU as a whole as anti-democratic will latch on to. You remember J.D. Vance latched on to this particular topic at the Munich Security Conference when he pointed the finger at the EU, saying, you know, you prevented Călin Georgescu from running. It was actually the Romanian courts that prevented him from running in the second round of the Romanian election recently, when it was feared that he'd, had some help from bots from Russia. The problem here with what's happened is not so much the actual technicalities of the first verdict, it's the fact that she's going to be blocked from running for office during what is very likely a long appeal. So essentially it knocks her out. And that's important for France because she and her father, and in fact her whole family, essentially are the far right in France.
That being said, nobody is outlawing the National Rally Party. It is perfectly welcome to stand another candidate for the presidency. Some of the reactions to this, I have to say, Michael, including from your own paper, have been somewhat bizarre. There has been an amount of hand-wringing commentary that all of this is perhaps either anti-democratic or somehow inflammatory, that we must not serve justice in case it rouses the ire of seething mobs of weirdos. I mean, it's honestly not that complicated, is it? You do the crime, you do the time.
Yes, but I think the problem is that, as Nina was saying, it's the length of time before the appeal. It's disenfranchising a very large part of the population.
No, it's not. They can still vote for the National Rally.
They could, yes, but she is by far the embodiment of it, by far more than anybody else. I mean, Bardella, the heir apparent, as it were, he's very young and inexperienced, and he could run in her place, but the point is that I think she embodies and has articulated a large part of French opinion. There's nothing wrong with the conviction. To suggest the conviction is a fix and it's wrong, that's stupid. She was fairly tried, fairly convicted. But there is the danger that all this will be seen as a stitch-up by the establishment, and it's a popular conspiracy among many people on the right that the establishment is dominated by liberals determined to stitch up any opposition. And this is the so-called stab in the back. There was the case that really propelled Hitler to power years and years ago. It was the idea Germany had been betrayed in 1919 by the Versailles Treaty, that they were stitched up and everything went wrong for Germany. The idea of any political group, we've been done over or we've been betrayed, is a dangerous myth to allow to get going.
But what else are you supposed to do, just to follow that up? Because she is claiming it's an establishment stitch-up, and she and her fellow populists claim literally everything is like an official establishment stitch-up. They would say that whatever verdict was handed down to them for whatever crime they may have committed, that's not a reason not to enforce the law.
Well, you can enforce the law, and certainly she should pay the fine, which is considerable, and she should be banned if her appeal fails.
The fine is 100,000 euros. She's been convicted of nicking north of 4 million.
Yes, well, I mean, you don't always get people to pay back exactly what they nick. That goes in any crime because they don't have it. It's been spent. And she does have to wear a prison bracelet tag thing, which is pretty humiliating. I mean, that
Nicolas Sarkozy has one.
Well, I know, that's also very humiliating. I mean, there's realpolitik, there's realism, and there's moral politics. I mean, and they sometimes don't always overlap.
And just to go back to your point, Andrew, about why, people can still vote for the National Rally. Mm-hmm. Hey, they could vote for Jordan Bardella or whoever the National Rally wants to present in 2027. The reality is that the French system is very different to our systems. It's not about the party, it's about the president. It's such an important executive presidency, which is why the figurehead matters so much. And in particular, with regards to the far right in France, the name Le Pen or any pedigree of Le Pen is important because essentially her father created this.
But, I mean, there's also possibly an argument that the Le Pen name is not quite the boon people may be assuming. There has been a Le Pen on every French presidential ballot since 1981, and they haven't won it.
But they've come closer than the far right has ever come. This would have been her fourth presidential run. Yes, she's lost three before, but and her father, since in the 1990s, was the one who really sort of crossed the Rubicon, smashed the glass ceiling there, and then managed to get into the second round of the presidential runoffs. And she's managed to do that too in the past. So, I mean, that's the crucial thing.
I think also it's important that she's tried to move the party away from the really toxic image that her father had of the anti-Semite, the person who denies the Holocaust, all that sort of dreadful lies that he was spouting. She's moved it, or tried to a right. Certainly it's still the right. It's still the right wing, but it's anti-immigrant and it's anti all sorts of things that the right traditionally espouses. But she's tried to occupy the mainstream a bit more, and one should welcome the fact that any major party shouldn't be at the extreme. If possible, it should tend towards the centre.
But if she's trying to remake the image of her party, shouldn't she have considered that before she nicked a whole bunch of other people's money?
Well, lots of people nick money.
Or took money from Russia, for instance.
I mean,
that was also toxic.
This is a common thing, and I mean, Sarkozy was accused of that.
Indeed.
And you wouldn't say he's an extremist.
No, I would not, but by the same token...
And Jacques Chirac, I think.
Yes,
right?
yes.
Well, indeed so, but I don't see a chorus of Orbáns, Maloney's, Salvini's, Farage's and Wilders demanding justice for Nicolas Sarkozy. It's almost like this is some sort of absurd partisan
Well, he's
gunfight.
out of office anyway. I mean, he's yesterday's man. I mean, it's a historic
So's
case.
Marine Le Pen at this point. Or
Yesterday's woman.
Yesterday's woman, yes, maybe.
Did we at least, before we move off this subject, enjoy Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, who I increasingly suspect of having a sense of humour, calling it a violation of democratic norms?
I've met him a few times. He does have a great sense of humour, actually. It's very dry, drier than, Greenland in midwinter, I suppose, you might say. I thought, you could imagine the Kremlin was going to latch on to what happened with Marine Le Pen. She originally the party couldn't get their hands on enough money, which is how they ended up in this situation, by essentially putting their hand allegedly inside the piggy bank.
Oh, it's not allegedly
Not allegedly
anymore.
now at this point. Pending appeal, I should say, inside the EU pot of money to then campaign domestically, because they couldn't raise funds domestically inside France. And at one point they had to rely upon funding coming from Russia.
I mean, this is the irony that Russia, once the great beacon of hope for leftists and Leninists and socialists the world over, is now the real supporter of all these right-wing groups throughout Western Europe. They're the ones that the Russians like, and they seem to have the same outlook.
And of course, there's one great irony in the comment that Dmitry Peskov made, where he said, we, and I'm paraphrasing largely, but he more or less said, we are raising an eyebrow at somebody, being prevented from being elected democratically. They, of course, famously did that to a number of their own candidates, most famously Alexei Navalny, who was barred from running for the presidency at one point thanks to trumped-up fraud charges.
Indeed so. Well, to Europe more generally now, and a reminder of one of the quirkier differences between the continent and the UK and US. In the UK and the US, Green parties are often characterised, sometimes though not always unfairly, as whimsical eccentrics who tend towards the view that most of humanity's problems may be resolved by joining hands and chorusing Kumbaya. Their European comrades can be somewhat harder of head, nowhere more so than in Germany. Green Party politicians from various German states have advanced a 10-point plan entitled Security Instead of Populism. It calls for, among other measures, an annual training day to improve crisis resilience. Michael, first of all, would you turn up for an annual day of improving crisis resilience?
It depends what's on offer. I mean, if there's sort of tea and beer and buns and things like that, it might be... No, I mean...
How does that improve your resilience to crisis?
I don't think it does. I mean, I think... It's a good idea, but it depends the degree to which the country is itself frightened that something awful is about to happen. If the situation, but Germans are very nervous about the general world situation, understandably, they're right in the middle of it, as it were, particularly East-West relations and what's happening in Russia. If there's a real sense that something bad is about to happen and that Germany and other countries are totally unprepared for any kind of civil defence or what might be a reaction to some dreadful catastrophe, military catastrophe, yes, then I think if it was advised that everyone goes, I might turn up. But I think we've not got to that point in this country, certainly. And I think it would be fairly ludicrous. I mean, who would give the talks and what would you do? You'd take away sort of notes about, what to stock in your underground cellar.
Well, there are European countries that do that, Nina.
I've been to film them,
as you would know. But as somebody such as yourself who has lived extensively on both sides of the Channel, do the British take this possibly less seriously than their continental brethren?
I think so, yeah, absolutely. It's a bit sort of dad's army over here. We've got a professional army. Everybody has an opinion about whether or not it's well enough stocked. But, we leave the soldiering to the professionals. And then, of course, you've got committed reservists as well. I think the conscription argument here in this country is way behind where it is in places like the Baltics, for instance.
Yeah. Well, they're much more front line. I mean, here the problem is that the reservists and the people who might come to help in an emergency are still seen through the eyes of Dad's Army, the civil defence during the Second World War, which was amusing and sometimes laughable and a good subject for a hit comedy series which is still running for years and years and years.
I'm trying to rise above the obvious jokes about how well you must remember your own service in the Home Guard, Michael. But how crisis resilient are you, for example?
Not at all. I mean, I'm afraid. Yes, I suppose I could switch on awareness of what might need to be done, but to know where to go to a local centre to provide emergency equipment in case of a bomb attack or whatever, I'm afraid I'm not briefed at all, and I probably should be.
Nina, do you take this stuff seriously for having lived in places where they do take it seriously? Nordic countries, for example, do advise all citizens to have 72 hours worth of tinned food, fresh water, batteries, torches,
and a wind-up radio, don't they, I think?
Wind-up radio.
To listen to Monocle, of course, right?
I'm not actually sure you can, unless you have wind-up internet. Do you have all of that where you live?
No, look, I'm a born and bred Londoner, lived elsewhere, but largely in other cities, so I'd be wholly unprepared for this. I have, as I said before, filmed with some of the, various different people in the Baltic countries, that try and get all these youngsters together to try and learn what to do into these moments of crisis and have drills. And by the way, the uptake is enormous. They're really, really committed. They really know what to do. But I would be utterly lost in a crisis. I suppose it's one of the pitfalls of living in a big city. You just assume that all of these things are,
But you made a very interesting point, Andrew, and that is it's the Greens who are pushing this in Germany. The Greens have quite a reputation now for being fairly hard-headed and hard-nosed, particularly on foreign policy. When the last coalition, it was the Greens who made the running on standing up for Ukraine rather than the Social Democrats. And, the Greens, yes, they have these green policies on nuclear energy and, cleaning up the planet and all that, fine, good. But they're also quite hard-headed with a sort of realpolitik about defending their own country.
Well, we will go now to China, which appears to be precisely where you should go if you are in the market for a cheap piano, though airlines may have views on you trying to take it home as cabin baggage. Circa the 1980s and 1990s, pianos and children being taught to play them became an emblem of China's emerging middle classes. However, and likely to the immense relief of the neighbours of China's emerging middle classes, the piano craze appears to have become a victim of a more stagnant economy. Two of China's biggest piano manufacturing concerns, Hailun and Pearl River, have posted double-digit year-on-year downturns. Nina, why is the piano the symbol of middle-class aspiration and not the trombone or the zither?
I don't know, because despite my parents' best efforts when I was young, I never really played it. I was given a violin instead, much to my
your
mother's
parents
annoyance.
Must have really hated your neighbours.
Exactly. I'm a twin. Both of us were given violins, which was rather discordant, as you can imagine. But I thought this was a really interesting
That must have
story.
emptied every house within about a one-block radius.
Well, considering as I grew up one block from here, yes, there you go. But I think this is a really interesting story because it's essentially sort of showing us the sort of social maturity of China now, and also how one generation is passing to another. I wonder what all of these parents who are teaching their children or not teaching their children, grilling them to grade 6 in piano, what else they're doing. What are they doing instead? Are they becoming computer coders? I don't know, because you can't imagine Chinese parents not, they're very ambitious for their children, particularly the middle classes. You can't imagine them not filling that void with something else academic.
Well, as long as they don't just fill it with watching, video games or playing these endless sort of high-resolution things on their screens and on their phones. I regret that the middle class has now decided they don't need to teach piano. I think it's a wonderful idea. Make everybody learn the piano. Make them understand music. Music you don't naturally acquire, but when you've had a little bit of immersion in this, it opens up a whole world of kind of creative and artistic endeavour. And who knows, you might have 100 million people in China who could be first-rate musicians.
God, what a din.
Well, there are, and there are loads of first-rate musicians from China, in fact, of the previous generation.
Yes, I think it's a great shame.
I do too. I agree. There is a ray of hope, and that is that my 9-year-old son is delighted to be going out on a full music day to play his guitar tomorrow. He's suddenly become immersed in music.
Excellent.
And
that is excellent.
Despite the fact that, we only started teaching him about now, which is relatively late.
But you may
there's hope for the piano. My husband plays the piano.
You may be able to answer, Nina, a question I have, which is why at a moment of economic downturn, piano lessons and such are the first things to go. Do we suspect a lot of parents going, oh no, we have slightly less money coming in than before. We won't be able to pay for Junior's piano lessons anymore. Oh no, what a shame. We'll have to sell the piano. Oh no, we can't listen to our child play piano anymore.
Either that or their child's really bad. But in the UK, obviously, there's a 25% VAT tax on private school fees that has kicked into action. So I can imagine that lots of extracurricular activities are going to be coming off the family budget. Exactly. Which is ironic because our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, apparently is a famous musician who plays the flute. I think he plays Shostakovich, doesn't he? Shostakovich, to calm himself down before,
Like Edward Heath used to sit at the organ and trumpet away, and the country went to the dogs.
Speaking as somebody who did play the flute at school, I cannot imagine that attempting to play Shostakovich on one is a remotely calming experience. Michael, were you ever taught or compelled to learn any sort of instrument?
I wasn't compelled. I was encouraged to learn the piano, and I did start it, and I quite enjoyed it. But then suddenly it sort of went wrong. partly because the lady that taught me had been doing this since before the headmaster was born, and so there was a certain feeling that there was a lack of sort of youthful enthusiasm there, and I regret not having pursued it. And I did try and take it up again when I was a correspondent overseas. I mean, I briefly had lessons when I was in Germany, and that went okay, but I just didn't seem to find time to practice. I think you must be compelled to do something if you take it up. You must be held to the discipline of practice and do it regularly. Otherwise, a natural laziness takes over and you think, I'll try, but then I won't go any further.
I think that's what we should be doing with Donald Trump's trade tariffs. I think he should be compelled to take up a musical instrument apart from playing his own trumpet.
But just before you worked on that for some time, Nina, and we appreciate it. But just before we move off this, because this is something that intrigues me, and your 9-year-old guitarist may be a useful case study for this, because I also learnt piano when I was a kid, and for me it went wrong basically, Michael, when I realised I was absolutely no bloody good. But do you think, Nina, that kids should be compelled, or does it have to be something they find their own way to and think, actually, I enjoy this is fun, and maybe I'm even quite good at it?
Let's face it, how many children really would pick up a violin, in my case, or a piano in your cases, and play for the time that's required to get better? Even my son, who's now picked up the guitar, wouldn't do it. No. So I think there's a very small chance that children have a natural innate desire to actually play musical instruments to a point where they would actually get better. But I'm really saddened to see this story actually with regards to China, because I think it speaks to something different in terms of sort of the cultural undertone of where China was going up until recently.
Yes, I think everybody's got to be taught the discipline. I mean, you've got to be taught to read in order to enjoy books. I mean, you can't say let children find their natural curiosity. You have to be taught the basics of art to try and draw a picture. All these things, you've got to be taught the basics before you can even decide whether or not that interests you. And that is, to some extent, the value of arts teaching in all schools at all levels, and I'm in favour of it.
Michael Binyon and Nina dos Santos, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, to the mating rituals of the black grouse. And not for the first time, it seems a shame that there isn't a little bell we can ding the first time a given phrase is uttered on Monocle Radio. Such is the subject of a new book entitled Bird, Sex and Beauty, The Extraordinary Implications of Charles Darwin's Strangest Idea, by the science writer Matt Ridley. I spoke to Lord Ridley at Midori House earlier and began by asking him to introduce his key protagonist.
The black grouse is a very special bird, I think. It lives in northern England, but all across northern Eurasia, a sort of subarctic bird. And it's quite a large chicken-sized bird. And the female is mottled brown and hard to spot. The male is shouting, "Look at me," because he's blue and he's red and he's black and he's white and he stands out like a sore thumb. And what's really curious about them, and a few other species do this, is that the males gather in the same spot every year, every day, for several months of the year, and knock 10 bells out of each other, and also display and sing, and for a couple of hours around dawn, and then they go off and feed as friends, and then next day they're back fighting and displaying, and it's always the same place, and there are, these places become well known to people, and it's called a lek, this way of behaving, and it's the most predictable natural history phenomenon there is. Funnily enough, I went to watch it this morning. I went to watch 2 leks this morning. I had a little time. It was a beautiful morning, and they're there. They're getting ready. They're not. The peak season is April, so the females are not going to show up for another month. But that's the purpose of the whole thing, is that the females have bred the males to do this gathering and competitive displaying so they can pick the one they like.
The narrative thrust of the book is you observing one particular lek and then sort of deviating into the thoughts, themes and questions that arise. And the subplot of the book, I guess, is what you refer to in the subtitle as Darwin's Strangest Idea, this being of sexual selection. And as you write, and as you were just alluding to there, once female preference is established, the females are slaves to fashion. So clearly some particular tenet in the male grouse becomes the thing that they want. But how clear has anybody, yourself included, ever got on what it is they're looking for and why they're looking for it?
Well, there's 150 years of debate about this in biology, in evolutionary biology, and I think it went wrong for quite a long time. I think Darwin was pretty well right at the start. He thought that colourful birds were being created by choosy females, generally males. It's not always that way around. There are some colourful females being chosen by choosy males, but mostly it's that way around. And everyone said, well, that's a bit far-fetched. Why? Why should females have an aesthetic taste, which is the very phrase he used? And he didn't actually have a good answer to that. But a guy called Ronald Fisher came along in 1930 and said, I think the reason is not because that way they get the best, fittest, toughest children, offspring, but because that way they get the sexiest offspring. Because if they don't follow the fashion, then the females are not going to choose their sons in the next generation. And so it's called the sexy son hypothesis, and it results in a runaway evolutionary process that produces dramatically exaggerated features like peacock's tails and things like that are random, that are arbitrary, that don't actually have a rhyme or a reason except to seduce females. It's a sort of circular argument, and it's quite a hard one to get your head around. And the mathematics works quite well. A guy called Russell Landy did some models in the 1980s. But for me, what Darwin was saying right at the start, back in the 1840s, when he was beginning to think about the origin of species, he started thinking about this too, and he said that beauty is its own reward. It's that actually there need be no other purpose to it. And he said that sexual selection by mate choice is a very different process from natural selection by survival of the fittest. Seduction of the hottest versus survival of the fittest is one way of putting it. I think we've underestimated the power of this particular mechanism of evolution.
But are they two quite different imperatives? Because you do write in the book that Darwin himself was somewhat vexed by birds generally and frankly just enraged by peacocks, because his glorious idea, this one of natural selection, survival of the fittest, is this rugged utilitarian principle that what works will prosper, what works is what will survive. And you have the male peacock trailing this ludicrous decoration around behind him, which must slow him down. It must virtually disable him. It must make him vastly easier to catch. Clearly, though, there is a reason for it.
Exactly. And that was why he wrote a letter to his friend Asa Gray in April 1860, in which he said, "The sight of a feather in a peacock's tail, when I gaze at it, makes me sick." And what he meant was that his critics, after he'd published The Origin of Species, were homing in on this and saying, well, it's all very well saying natural selection created all these different species and things, but how do you explain something like a peacock's tail or a hummingbird's plumage or something? That's clearly not helping it survive. In fact, it's probably hindering its survival. And he said, well, yes, but I think if females choose males according to particular criteria, they'll produce outcomes that work as reproductive devices, but not as survival devices. So it's helping the peacock reproduce, but it's not helping him survive.
At which point, though, we do have to, I guess, admit that birds clearly do have aesthetic preferences. And this is where your book becomes an extended meditation on the nature of beauty, what we find beautiful and why we find it beautiful, because admiring the plumage of the male peacock is something that we as humans clearly have in common with peacocks.
Exactly. And Darwin makes this point too, and I'm very struck by it, and it's pretty baffling. My common ancestor with a peacock lived 400 million years ago, and it was a lumbering reptile in a swamp, which which didn't have any plumage of any kind. So how come when I hear a curlew singing or see a peacock displaying, I say, wow, that's beautiful? Why have we converged on it? And I don't have a very good answer to that, but the beginning of an answer is that the song has pure notes in it, and the peacock's tail has pure colours in it, pure wavelengths, and those are improbable structures to produce, if you see what I mean. That if you just randomly produce colours, you're going to produce browns. You've got to really make an effort to produce blues and greens and reds, and the same for pure notes as opposed to clicking or grunting noises. And so, in some sense, we are both of us rewarding the ability to make improbable structures and sounds in the world.
That was Matt Ridley speaking to me earlier. His book, Bird, Sex and Beauty, The Extraordinary Implications of Charles Darwin's Strangest Idea, is available now. That's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Michael Binyon. The show was produced by Tom Webb and researched by Francesca Jilks. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.